Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Doctors for America Lunch and Learn. I'm Malvika Goval, and I'm on the Drug Affordability Action Team with Doctors for America, and I'll be moderating the discussion today. Can y'all hear me? Okay, awesome. So the purpose of our Lunch and Learn series is to provide the 20,000 clinicians and trainees in our network with valuable learning opportunities to supplement their advocacy efforts. And our hope is that these sessions will also provide doctors and medical students with an opportunity to connect with others doing health advocacy work, which is of interest to them. So we have a few ground rules for our advocacy grand rounds and all of our events. So there's no such thing as a stupid question. And then speaking of questions, please remember to use the Zoom's Q&A feature. So we'll address your questions during the second half of our session. And look out for comments in the chat. So our DFA staff will be sharing helpful links during the session as well. And then please be mindful in your questions and comments that every individual is at a different stage in their education or their advocacy. And for some people, it's a first step. For others, it's a continuing education opportunity. And we welcome everyone as you are from wherever you are in your advocacy journey. And we would like to encourage patience and good intentions from all participants. So we'll be live streaming to Facebook Live and making a recording, and all our materials are available afterwards. So our session for today is on the path towards insulin for all, access, affordability, and biosimilars. Insulin is an essential hormone that we all rely on every single day, helping us to convert the sugar found in the foods we eat into energy to fuel our bodies. Yet for nearly 8 million Americans with diabetes, their bodies do not produce or sense insulin effectively, and they have to take exogenous insulin daily to live. This past weekend on November 14th was World Diabetes Day, and 2021 marks the 100th anniversary of the discovery of insulin. It's a remarkable story. In 1920, Sir Frederick Banting, a Canadian scientist and surgeon, began working on isolating and extracting insulin. And Charles Best, who was a medical student, was helping him test out insulin in dogs. And on July 27th, 1921, they successfully isolated the hormone insulin for the first time at the University of Toronto. Banting and his team were awarded the American patents for insulin in 1923. They ended up selling the patent to insulin to the University of Toronto for $1 each, with Sir Frederick Banting famously saying, "Insulin does not belong to me, it belongs to the world." He wanted everyone to have access to insulin. In order to mass produce it in humans, Eli Lilly and co. were given the rights to make insulin, and the rest is pretty much history. A condition that was once fatal was now manageable, and over the years, many things have changed. New players came into the insulin market, different insulin formulas were developed that were safer, more effective. These included analog insulin formulas such as Lilly's Humalog and Novo Nordisk's Novolog, as well as longer acting formulas like Sanofi's Lantus. But something else has changed as well, the price. So over the last 2 decades, we've seen the price of insulin skyrocket in the US, and a single vial of analog insulin formulas like Lilly's Humalog, which started at just $26 a vial when it was released in the mid-90s, has skyrocketed. And for patients who have high deductible health insurance plans or who lose or lack health insurance, these high prices are dangerous, and they lead nearly 25% of patients with diabetes to underuse their insulin, which thereby risking their lives. COVID-19 has been particularly challenging for patients with diabetes, not only because it puts them at risk for severe complication or death, but also because patients with diabetes have experienced higher rates of unemployment and financial suffering during the pandemic, which eats into their savings more rapidly. I imagine that each of us has cared for at least one patient who couldn't afford his or her insulin and ended up in the emergency room with diabetic ketoacidosis. It's unfair, it's dangerous, and it's a tragedy. There are many reasons why the price of insulin remains incredibly expensive even after 100 years since its initial discovery, and our expert panelists will soon enlighten us about this and more. One major reason is the lack of competition in the insulin market. For many decades, insulin production in the US has been dominated by 3 pharmaceutical manufacturers, Eli Lilly, Novo Nordisk, and Sanofi, who have been accused of price gouging. Earlier this year, in July 2021, the FDA approved the first interchangeable biosimilar insulin product for the treatment of diabetes, Semglee, which can be substituted for its reference product Lantus or Glargine. A biosimilar provides hope that some competition in the insulin market will lower the price of brand name insulin. Recently, we've also heard about the Build Back Better Act that is being negotiated in Congress, and this includes provisions to lower the cost of prescription drugs by allowing Medicare to negotiate prices, including insulin, and it caps the out-of-pocket cost for insulin at $35 a month for people who have insurance. Today, we are in for a treat with 3 fantastic expert panelists, including Ms. Laura Marston, Dr. Kasia Lipska, and Dr. Amit Sarpatwari. At this time, I'll kindly ask our speakers to briefly introduce themselves, and then we'll get started. So let's begin introductions, and each panelist will speak for about 5 to 7 minutes, followed by a moderated Q&A after everyone's finished. So please share your questions, comments, concerns in the chat, and we'll do our best to take as many questions from as many guests as we can. Thanks. And then Dr. Sarpatwari, you can go ahead and start with an introduction.
Sounds good. Can you guys see this and hear me okay? Terrific. Okay. Greetings, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. My name is Amit Sarpatwari. I'm an epidemiologist and a lawyer, and I work in a group called the Program on Regulation Therapeutics at Law at Brigham and Women's Hospital and Harvard Medical School. And I'm just going to time myself to make sure I'm okay. But what I'm here to talk about really is now insulin is, since 2020, classified formally as a biologic. I am here to talk a little bit about competition and what biosimilars can do in this market and the progress and challenges and possible reforms that we might see. And so just a bit of disclosures in terms of research support, consulting, and serving as an expert witness. And here's where I'll start. So biologics, what are they? They're large molecules with very large price tags. So they're large, complex molecules or molecular mixtures derived from living systems. They're not easily characterized. They're often physician administered, not in the case of diabetes medication. So not in the case of insulin. And here you can sort of see the size of various molecules. In a small molecule like aspirin is far smaller than something like insulin, but then there are far more complex biologics like monoclonal antibodies. The biologics in general are a key driver of increased prescription drug spending. They're expensive. Many are over $100,000 per patient per year. They accounted for 48% of net manufacturer revenue in 2019, and they account for an increasing proportion of drug approvals. This poses a substantial burden on patients and even patients with insurance. So average annual out-of-pocket costs for several biologics can exceed $5,000 in Medicare Part D. So how do we address the fact that these costs are so high, these prices are so high? One question is, does competition help? And when we're talking about brand-to-brand competition, we don't have very good evidence that that actually lowers the price meaningfully. What we do know is that the only type of competition that consistently and substantially lowers prices occurs from, at least in the case of small molecule drugs, from generic drugs. And I'll talk about why in just a second. But even there, it's critical to note that you need at least 3 manufacturers of the generic drug to really introduce meaningful competition and drive the price down. So how does that work? Well, at least in the small molecule space, there was something called the Hatch-Waxman Act passed in 1984, which created an abbreviated new drug application pathway for versions of the same drug made by different manufacturers. Now, here we're talking again about critically small molecule drugs. And the basis of approval was showing that the generic drug has the same active ingredient, dosage form, and strength, as well as the same absorption of the active ingredient at the target site. So what did that allow generic manufacturers to do was forego the expensive late stage clinical testing. As long as I could show bioequivalence, I could come to market. And that coupled critically with what we call state drug product selection laws. These are laws across all 50 states, which authorize or mandates pharmacists to substitute prescriptions for a brand name drug with a generic. When combined, this abbreviated pathway with the drug product selection laws, we saw an incredible success story. From 1984 to 2017, you saw the number of prescriptions that were filled with generics jump from 19% to 90%. It's possible that generic drugs can provide greater than 80% cost savings compared to the brand name drug, and it's resulted in over 1.6 trillion in savings over the past decade. So let's fast forward to biologics now. So why do we not call them generic drugs? We call the versions of biologics made by different manufacturers biosimilars. The reason is owing to that complexity of the molecule size and our ability to analyze the sort of sameness of that molecule compared to its originator molecule. But in the same way that Hatch-Waxman existed, there was passed as part of the Affordable Care Act in 2010, the Biologics Price Competition and Innovation Act, which created an abbreviated approval pathway for follow-on biologics, similar but more extensive than the pathway for small molecule generics. And there were two possible approvals: biosimilars, which were highly similar and for which there was no clinically meaningful difference with regard to safety, purity, and potency, and interchangeable biologics, biosimilars that can be expected to produce the same clinical result in any given patient. So there's required to get that heightened designation, which would allow pharmacists to automatically substitute, required an assessment of the safety of switching between the originator biologic and follow-on biologic. And Dr. Lipska will talk a little bit about how that worked. That switching study came out in the case of Semglee. So let's take a look at what we have on the market now. We have 31 approved biosimilars for 10 originator biologics, the first approval being in 2015. Yet only 65% are marketed, and there's widely varying uptake. But here you can sort of see for insulin glargine, we do have one approved biosimilar and one that is marketed the same one. What are some of the factors that are contributing to the market of biosimilars and how robust that competition can be? One is this question of approval standards. The FDA actually has the discretion to waive clinical trials if there's no quote unquote residual uncertainty. And although in the early days, FDA seemingly required a lot more than the EMA, the European Medical Agency, did, subsequently, it's gotten more efficient. And in the case of second to market biosimilars, it's actually waiving the requirement of these phase 3 trials. When we talk about interchangeability, there was long a reticence for FDA to declare that interchangeability. And the reason being is a concern over possible immunogenicity, although the evidence really doesn't bear that out that well. In addition, you can see that in switching studies, but also the safe use of biosimilars in Europe for over a decade, in which there was wholesale switches of certain countries from one biologic product to a biosimilar and back. And so the first interchangeable insulin glargine Semglee approved in July 2021 marks a really big step. But the real question is, how well is this going to work in the market? One issue is how well the drug product selection laws will actually function. So interestingly, we did a study comparing these laws, and there's actually a heightened barrier in these laws with regard to small molecule substitution. So oftentimes in certain states, where it requires, it mandates substitution for the pharmacist, it makes it permissive in the case of biosimilar substitution or interchangeable biologic substitution. The most critical change, though, is from this notion of there being no requirement to notify the physician. There is, for almost in every state, a requirement for the pharmacist to notify the physician. So is a pharmacist going to go to that step of making the substitution and notify the physician, or are they going to say that that's too much of a hassle given my busy workload? Let's just prescribe dispense the medication that was prescribed. Then there's all sorts of issues, and I'm just going to hand wave a little bit of this so we can talk in Q&A about issues of patent thickets, of these massive fortresses of intellectual property on these products, which are presenting a problem in terms of some biosimilars being able to come to market. So we see a number of biologics that have been approved, but not all of them have come to market. That is largely has resulted in a loss of significant savings. So just take the case of Humira, which already exists in its biosimilar form in the EU and won't exist in the US until 2023. We estimated that just in Medicare alone, the lack of biosimilars cost Medicare over $2 billion. There's also challenges when it comes to the market in terms of companies making rebates conditional upon exclusive sourcing. So this capitalizes on a difficulty of switching patients from a certain product to another. And so you can imagine that this is going to be an issue when it comes to insulin. And we can talk more about this. But there's significant challenges at the regulatory level and at the market level that is going to, depending on how things play out, determine the success of how well insulin biosimilars and interchangeable biologics will actually lower prices. So look forward to talking more about this.
Thank you so much. And then Dr. Lipska, you're next.
Thanks so much, everyone. And let me just put this on. And thanks to Dr. Sarpatwari for setting me up so nicely to talk about the case of Semglee. Here are my disclosures. And just a little bit on the landscape of biosimilar insulin products. So now that you understand the difference between a biosimilar and interchangeable insulin, let's go through what we have available. So in terms of biosimilar products, we have Basaglar, which is biosimilar to Lantus, as well as Admelog, which is biosimilar to Humalog. But as was already mentioned, Semglee is the first biosimilar and interchangeable insulin. And this, as was already mentioned, was announced on July 28th, 2021, almost to the date for the discovery of insulin 100 years later. FDA approved that first interchangeable biosimilar product for diabetes. And the hope is that this will make it more accessible and lower the cost of insulin for people with diabetes. And as the acting FDA Commissioner, Janet Woodcock, said, this is a momentous day, or was, for people who rely daily on insulin for treatment of diabetes, as biosimilar and interchangeable biosimilar products have the potential to greatly reduce healthcare costs. The approval of the first interchangeable biosimilar product furthers FDA's longstanding commitment to support a competitive marketplace for biological products and ultimately empowers patients by helping to increase access to safe, effective, and high-quality medications at potentially lower cost. And I think, as Dr. Sarpatwari said, we shall see, and this is part of this discussion, like, is this going to really work to reduce the price? So why is the first biosimilar product, Semglee, why is it biosimilar to Lantus? And this should be no surprise to those of you who are people living with diabetes or physicians who are treating patients with diabetes. Lantus is a widely recognized product, and looking at these data from 2016 to 2020 at the types of insulins that are prescribed, and this is for people with type 2 diabetes, Glargine is a mammoth, right? This is like the most popular insulin that's being prescribed. And so the decision to start with Semglee was very strategic. So what is the evidence for interchangeability? And as Dr. Sarpatwari mentioned, that product has to be shown to be both safe and effective, as well as produce similar results in patients in patients when switched. So in terms of the evidence available, there were, and I'm not going to go through it like in great detail, but there were two relatively large randomized controlled trials comparing Semglee against the Refrus Lantus. One was in people with type 1 diabetes and one in people with type 2 diabetes. And there were no changes or no differences between the two arms with respect to the change in A1C and also with respect to safety, namely hypoglycemic events. But then there was also this phase 3 switching study, which I think is something worth talking about a little bit more, because now we're talking about interchangeability, meaning that the pharmacist can substitute that insulin without necessarily clinician's authorization. And so the switching study included 63 people with type 1 diabetes and 64 people, randomized to insulin glargine, so the reference product, and then 64 people with type 1 diabetes who are randomized to a sequence of Mylan's Semglee for 12 weeks, switched over to the reference product, and then back to Semglee for follow-up of 40 weeks. And what they looked at is, again, changes in A1C levels, not time and range, by the way, right? So you can see that the change in A1C level and the difference between the arms and the overall A1C level, which was kind of on the higher side, you can see almost 8, was not different between the groups. The actual daily basal insulin dose was a little bit lower for Semglee compared with the reference product. And in terms of hypoglycemia, the first top panels show the proportion of people with hypoglycemic events, and the top two at the bottom show the rates of hypoglycemic reactions. And although it did look like the incidence of nocturnal hypoglycemia was a little bit higher with Semglee, this was not statistically significant. But remember, this was a pretty small study. Overall, though, the conclusions were that the two arms had similar efficacy with respect to A1C lowering as well as hypoglycemic reactions. So what happens now? Now, as clinicians, when we write a prescription for Lantus, and depending on the state, when the patient goes to the pharmacy, the pharmacist may be able to dispense Semglee without notifying me ahead of time. Although there is this requirement for notification of the clinician, and how well that's going to work, we shall see. I have not been receiving a lot of notifications, but I just did yesterday about a patient who was given or dispensed Semglee. The big question is it going to lower the price? And when I looked very crudely, okay, at the current cash price that you can get for Lantus, Solastar pens, or Semglee pens, when you go on GoodRx, you see that the price is actually much lower for Semglee. But Laura notified me of a loophole here, so I was fooled. The Semglee that's apparently posted on GoodRx is not actually the interchangeable Semglee, it is a biosimilar product. But when you look at the list price for the actual Lantus versus Semglee that's listed, it's only about $20 less for the interchangeable Semglee. So not a huge savings yet, but as Dr. Sarpatwari said, it may take some time for that price to come down for the competition to take hold. There are potential challenges. I think many of them were already mentioned. So manufacturers may offer larger rebates for their originator products, which may jack up the list price. Patent disputes may ensue. There may be exclusionary contracting by payers. And of course, there may be newer, improved versions of insulin with new patents that start this cycle over. So I think time will tell whether or not this is, as promised by the FDA commissioner, a new era in terms of insulin use. And I know we're going to hold questions, so just wait. But I wanted to share this picture, which is from the 1970s, where Lilly was advertising insulin U40 and U80 for less than $1, 89 cents for U40 and $1.79. So much has changed.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Dr. Lipska. And then Ms. Laura Marston, you're next.
Hey everybody, and thank you Amit and Kasia for setting up the issue. My name is Laura Marston. I have type 1 diabetes. I've had it for 25 years. I was diagnosed type 1 diabetic in 1996. And I have used Humalog insulin to keep myself alive since my diagnosis. Interestingly, Humalog was released almost at the exact same time I was diagnosed. So I was put on it fairly immediately. I still use it. I don't use a long-acting insulin because I use an insulin pump. So I still use Humalog. The only thing that's changed about Humalog since my diagnosis 25 years ago has been the price has gone up over 1,200%. So I remember my mom buying my first vial of Humalog, and it was $21. That was, without using insurance. And I remember as a 14-year-old saying to her, like, that's a lot of money. Like, I'm doing the math in my head. I need 2 to 3 vials a month, and for life. And that amount of money has just increased. From the patient perspective, for biosimilars and biologics and interchangeability, I have to say personally, I have a lot of hesitation about it, because as a type 1 diabetic, our control over our blood sugar is paramount to preventing the complications you hear of, kidney failure, damage to eyes, nerves, etc. And so I use my insulin pump to calculate dosages down to the 100th of a decimal point of insulin. It took me about 20 years of trial and error using Humalog to really get the hang of it, to the point where now my A1C is consistently below 6.5%. But for the first, I'd say 15 years of my since my diagnosis, my A1C was steady over 10%, because it is a lot of trial and error from on your own body as a diabetic. And I guess that's the second point I really want to call out, is that the interchangeability designation really makes me nervous, because I imagine, buying that first vial of Humalog, like I was just talking about. And I imagine, when you're diagnosed with type 1, you're put in the hospital, and you have this very intensive training with dietitians and endocrinologists. And I imagine being 14 and hearing a doctor give me instructions about, for instance, Lantus, and how much to take and when to take it, and then going to the pharmacy and getting something different, knowing that insulin it's dangerous, that one low blood sugar could take your life. That makes me nervous, because I wonder how much that puts the burden back on the patient to then reach out to the doctor and get further instruction, or in the States, obviously, where the doctor would be notified, that would be great. Possibly the doctor would then call the patient, or the patient can just take the same dosage of Semglee, for example, if that's the substitution. But that's still a risk. And as Kasia was just laying out with the studies, it wasn't, the interchangeability status wasn't necessarily on a 1 unit to 1 unit interchangeability. We're looking at metrics beyond that. So I just wonder how much, and I don't have the answer to this, but how much of that is a danger to patients, when from a patient perspective, at the end of the day, I think the answer to the rising list prices of insulin is not more competition, but rather is federal government action to cap what the manufacturers can charge. So just a brief patient perspective there, playing a little bit of devil's advocate here, because honestly, anything that can bring down the price of insulin and make it accessible to more, especially the uninsured, it is a step in the right direction. But unfortunately, we're so far we're in such a bad situation where 1 in 4 diabetics are rationing insulin to survive that I'm hopeful we can make several steps forward to address this issue.
Awesome. Thank you so much to all of you. So we're gonna start with the Q&A now. So does anyone in the audience have any questions? We can start off with some questions that we kind of put together. So first off is, you guys kind of touched on this in all of your talks, but I just kind of to directly ask, like, wasn't insulin invented like hundreds of years ago? Like, why is it so expensive now?
Agreed.
I was going to say the same thing. It's very simple. It's profit, right? It's a profit making, and they charge as much as they can. And unless we say they can't, they'll continue.
And I'll just play a little bit of devil's advocate. So there are people in the economics world who get upset when you say insulin's over 100 years old, because they'll say that the product has been refined, improved upon. You've got recombinant insulin now. But Laura's point is very well taken. That, I mean, if you talk about what she's been on, that hasn't changed in 20 years, and the price that she's paying has certainly changed. And the answer is exactly what Kasia said, is that we're in a system that will sustain prices as long as the market will bear them, and we really have cut the ability of the payers to negotiate in a successful way. And so unless we take action at larger pricing reform, this is going to be difficult. And there's, for patients' sake, capping the price on what they're going to pay out of pocket is important, but if we don't tackle the uninsured patients, that's problematic. And if we don't also address the larger systemic costs, that is not really solving the problem. So of course, pharmaceutical companies are happy to go with with capping out-of-pocket costs, because they know that the overall cost will continue to remain very, very high.
I think that's an important distinction that Amit makes from a patient perspective. No one should be making any percentage of $300 per 10 milliliter vial for insulin. I mean, you can talk about there have been advances in the past, etc. But today, and I'm not a scientist, I'm not a doctor, I'm a lawyer, so just putting that out there. But as I understand it, insulin is made by bacteria replicating in essentially large vats. In every other country, a vial of insulin is $20 or less, or free to the patient, because insulin for diabetics, or actually for all humans, it is like oxygen. We can't have an absence of it. We can't negotiate it. We have to buy it or we die. And when you have such an imminent need for a product, especially one that's for profit, unless the government steps in, the sky is really the limit for the prices.
Okay, appreciate it. Dr. Sarpathwari, were you going to say something?
Yeah, I guess it's just important to also note that, one thing that manufacturers do, and again, touched on in Kasia's talk, is continuously tweak the product. And usually these results in tweaks to the devices, but it's something called product hopping is the sort of lingo that's used. And product hopping really means incremental changes to a product. So in its negative sense, that doesn't really offer much additional benefit, but will extend the market exclusivity of that product. And if you're able to shift patients onto that newer product, you essentially can ensure that you will remain free of competition, and particularly in a dynamic where physicians are historically not trained to consider cost, but trained to consider what they think is the best product for the patient, it's easy to have marketing that will convince you that that is the best product for the patient. And that really is a problematic aspect of all this. And totally understand. I hope we get a chance to dive into Laura's concerns about interchangeable biologics, and it's not something we can force upon patients. I do think that there is a place for it as being a solution, but totally understand the hesitancy. But I think there's more in terms of the data that we need to share, about the experiences that we need to share to convince people that this is safe and effective. But that's not going to work if we just unilaterally try to impose that on to providers and patients. And so a lot more thoughts, but I'll stop there for a second.
Awesome. Thanks so much for all those perspectives. Kind of going off where you were saying about how doctors aren't trained necessarily to think about the costs, for physicians who are, seeing their patients struggle to afford their insulin it's very frustrating. How can we help our patients who are struggling with those costs?
Well, I think the first thing as clinicians is we need to ask our patients about the potential struggles or challenges they have with the affordability of insulin and acknowledge that this is a burden. This is something that some may bring to their clinician, but some may not feel comfortable bringing it up. And so I think it's our job to make sure that that's in the conversation. And then there are lots of different, I shouldn't say, there are some options that clinicians have in terms of, thinking about coverage options, in terms of insurance options, in terms of sourcing the insulin from different pharmacies, using the 340B program, potentially thinking about any assistance programs that are available. But I think the first and the most important step is to have that conversation with the patient. And then also to be an advocate, right? To see these problems and talk about them, because I think in the clinic, when I said like lots of different, there's not that many things we can do as clinicians in the clinic, but that's why I think we need to talk about it and change the policy so that we can do something long-term for everyone.
And if I could just interject, because I think there's one question in the chat that seems perfectly suited for this. I guess I'll pose it to Kasia, is where do regular insulin and NPH fit into this discussion of brand name versus biosimilar versus interchangeable biosimilar?
Right, so there are no biosimilar or interchangeable versions of NPH and regular as far as I know. All of these insulin products are still considered sort of brand products. And although NPH and regular are less expensive when bought at certain places like Walmart, they're not necessarily, very, very cheap. And there is a place for them for some patients. But as I think Laura alluded to, and as I think about this, when we talk about diabetes and insulin use for people with diabetes, it's just that the disease is so different in different people. So when you take somebody who's had type 1 diabetes for a long time and is titrating their doses to the hundredths decimal, that's a person where both the issues of interchangeability and using a specific product are going to be really important. And then there are people who have type 2 diabetes who are newly diagnosed, and that our treatment does not have to be so precise. We just need to provide some insulin. And for some of those patients, particularly early in the course of their disease, when they're still making insulin, they just need a little bit more. Some of these products, NPH and regular, can be perfectly safe and effective, but it just depends. It depends on the person.
I just want to add on quickly to the question about how physicians can help patients get insulin. And just as an FYI for everyone on the call, we as patients, as grassroots patients, have a underground insulin exchange. And so worst case scenario, if you ever have a patient that you can't find a program for or that doesn't qualify, feel free to reach out to me or directly, or we search on social media for the hashtag insulin for all. So anybody can say, I'm out of Humalog, I need Humalog insulin, hashtag insulin for all, and we'll find it and essentially crowdsource it for them.
And then just one final thing on the physician discussion with patients on cost. You know, one of our biggest struggles is real-time benefits information, and not having that at the time of care, at the time of the visit. And so, you know, there are movements to try to improve that, to know what the patient will pay out of pocket given where they are in their insurance, and how much of their deductible has been met. But that's also stuff that factors into it, but it's also considerably a headache, and Kasha can speak more to this than I can, but knowing that the insurance company may switch their coverage every 6 months or every year, effectively forcing a change in the patient.
Okay. Yeah, those are all like excellent ways. And then as well, I think one thing that you can consider is joining the DFA Drug Affordability Action Team. And one of us will share the link in the chat for that. But that's one way to kind of get involved and become an advocate. No matter where you are starting out, we always welcome anyone who's interested in learning more. So.
And that's such a huge, what you just said and what Kasha said, getting doctors involved in our grassroots advocacy. I mean, you all understand what we're going through, you know, almost as well as we do, and a lot of times potentially have more of a voice than we as individual patients. And so it's really, really powerful and meaningful to me as a patient when doctors speak out about this. I mean, I tell Kasha, I still remember where I was the first time I read Kasha's 2015 article on insulin prices in the New York Times. Like, and I don't think you can understate the power of that, both in serving your patients and just in serving, you know, what's right.
Awesome. So we're gonna move to audience Q&A. So let's see. Okay. Mr. Donald Leiter. So any comment about which payers have the best coverage for insulin, or do they all have about the same coverage?
In my experience, they all have different coverage. Like literally, I was recently thinking about, I have an HMO plan. I was thinking about switching to my company's PPO plan, and I just decided not even to do it because it's almost impossible to calculate ahead of time what your copays are going to be and what your coverage is for insulin. Sometimes you can find out ahead of time that they cover one insulin or the other. For example, I am deathly allergic to any insulin made by Novo Nordisk. I can't take them. My insurance formulary prefers Novo Nordisk, so I have to go through the prior authorization process every year. But I have been on a lot of insurance plans in my adult years, and every single one of them just vastly different in insulin coverage and how affordable that is.
And I think that varies regionally as well. I was going to say from, you know, in my experience in terms of getting insulin covered for patients, Medicaid in my state works very well. It is generous coverage for insulin, and I'm always able to prescribe it. But that's variable across, you know, the United States, and obviously not everyone's going to be able to be covered by Medicaid. Medicare, I find very difficult for many patients, and particularly the donut hole and a lot of the coinsurance costs are difficult to navigate. And then private insurance is just so vastly variable.
Okay, great. That was very helpful. So another question from Pat Herndon. So what about all the financial intermediaries, the pharmacy benefit managers? rules and the forces that result in ever increasing pricing of any and all pharmaceutical products. Seems to me that it's all the financial networks that constantly raise pricing of insulin or any other pharma products. And these financial networks simply create the illusion of competition and the illusion of an invisible hand.
So I guess I'll jump into this, and I understand the frustration, and there is a perverse incentive here because, I think Kasha touched on this. The PBMs will have an incentive to raise list prices because if they can negotiate down a larger delta in terms of what the net price is that they're going to pay, they will make more money. And so that's had the effect of really inflating the list price. But on the other side of it is the fact that the net prices of insulin, there is a grain of truth to their argument that the manufacturer's argument that the net prices have largely remained flat over the last 5 years or so. And so the real question is, there are savings in the system that are happening. What are they being used for? Increasingly, I don't like to scapegoat PBMs too much. I think there's equal, if not more, culpability at the end of the manufacturers. But and PBMs have been reforming to the extent that they're saying they're passing on the savings. But part of the problem is lack of transparency. How much of that savings is being transferred to the payers? And then what are the payers doing with that savings? Are they actually alleviating the burden of patients, or are they using it to lower premiums, or are they just pocketing the money? I mean, there's a lot of questions as far as who is acting in what manner that need to be better established and better regulated. But the notion that we should be a little bit wary, I think, about manufacturers blaming PBMs very heavily. It's likely because PBMs are actually effective in securing significant rebates. Now, the problem of it lowering patient costs is a separate but related story.
Yeah, and I think that that's a great point that I wanted to make is, first and foremost, I think the distinction between price and cost is very important. Cost is what the patient pays out of pocket, so it may be a copay. Price is set solely by the manufacturer. In fact, the PBMs could not be involved in the manufacturer's setting of the prices without it blatantly violating antitrust laws. So it's the manufacturer alone that sets the prices. And then in terms of, I guess, Amit's last point, and now it's slipping my mind exactly how you phrased it.
I guess I was just saying there is savings happening in the system, but where it's going is is part of the problem.
Well, absolutely. The other point that I wanted to say was that when we talk about PBMs, we have to remember that only applies to people with insurance. And as a diabetic who has lost insurance for no fault of my own prior to the Affordable Care Act, when diabetics, prior to 2014, diabetics were uninsurable except under an employee plan. I could not buy insurance at any price because I'm insulin dependent. So it took the pre-existing condition protections of the ACA to make folks even able to buy insurance if they can afford it. So I have a hard time assigning too much blame to PBMs because from my perspective as a patient, that's also the drug makers saying, well, we know that someone without insurance, it gets charged the full amount, the most, the $300 a vial, and we don't care. And that's just not acceptable from my perspective because that means lives lost.
Yeah, so that kind of links nicely to a question that we had. It's more also linked to the current Build Back Better Act that's being proposed. So will the proposed insulin price cap of $35 per month in out-of-pocket costs included in the latest Build Back Better Act apply to all patients or only those with Medicare Part D?
as I understand the proposal, it will apply to Medicare patients generally. I'm not sure that the Part D specification continues. So I think it will apply to all Medicare patients and to those on private insurance, but leaving the issue that the uninsured are still paying the list price, which is unfortunately the problem.
Yeah, for sure. And what do you, oh, sorry, go ahead.
I'm just curious, Laura. So, I mean, but let's take the insured patients, though. Capping it at $35, how meaningful is this going to be? I'm just curious about your reception to, I mean, I know the problems with the patients who are uninsured, but how do you feel about the provision itself for people who are insured?
I don't think anyone has any metrics on how meaningful it will be. Like, we don't know how many people who are insured actually pay more than $35 copays. So we don't even know how many it's affecting. You would have to be on an ERISA regulated plan for the Build Back Better to apply. There are some states who have for state insured plans, like Colorado, they have copay caps as well. So we don't know how meaningful it will be, but I will say this, from the lives we have lost to insulin rationing, the vast majority, if not all, were uninsured. Were either temporarily uninsured, recently uninsured. So as a patient, that's my biggest fear, is if I lose, I may have a $35 copay today, but what if I lose my job tomorrow and lose my health insurance along with it? It may have positive effects for people's pocketbooks, but I worry most that the really poor messaging that's being done on this, calling it price caps, can really set back our grassroots advocacy movement, because we have draft price caps ready to go, and that's what we need passed. And we don't want, society as a whole to think, oh, we've already done this, everybody's good, as people are still falling through the cracks.
So our group has actually looked, and it's not published yet, some unpublished data using nationally representative MEPS data, where we looked actually at these questions about how much people are paying out of pocket, how are they covered, and what would different caps on out-of-pocket spending do. And what we've found is that by and large, there are lots of outliers of people who spend really astronomical amounts on insulin. But we've also used the metric called set by the WHO for catastrophic spending, which is spending more than 40% of your post-subsistence income on insulin. And we found that even with these, pretty good caps of $35, lots of people still experience catastrophic spending on insulin. And, that really speaks to the fact that there are lots of people who have very small incomes and really struggle and paying for insulin, even when it seems maybe modest to some of us, actually can really drain their post-subsistence income. So hopefully I'll be able to share more soon.
Awesome. We might have time for one more question. Or I can wrap up so that we can just finish up on time. I'll go ahead and wrap up now, just so we don't cut in too much. So thank you guys so much. Just closing, thank you so much for a great conversation. And we're so grateful you were able to join us today. I also wanted to share a couple of quick reminders. So I wanted to say that this event will be available for viewing later on DFA's YouTube channel. And then there's a link in the chat for a survey that you can complete, just so we can learn more about from what went well and what sessions you might like to see in the future. And then we'll also send a follow-up email with that survey link. And if you haven't seen our awesome new website yet, please take a moment and check it out. You'll find it, or you'll find on it on-demand education, advocacy resources, and also we're working on a membership directory to connect with other like-minded doctors and health advocates. So that'll be out soon. And you can sign up to be a member today, and all the content will be going behind a paywall in January. So the link's in the chat now. And other than that, please remember to follow us on Twitter, LinkedIn, Facebook to stay up to date with all the DFA programs, events, and ways to get engaged. There's an events page on our website, and we do have several events coming up and kind of always going on. So thank you so much for attending, and have an awesome rest of your day. It was really good to see everyone come out and hear from you all. Thank you.